At the beginning of the year, I set myself a goal to read at least 25 books. And as of about a week ago, I met that goal. I also decided to start a reading journal. I know everyone does a reading journal differently, they do it in their own way. The way I'm testing this out, because I've never really done this before, is just tracking which books I finished in which month, how many books were rereads versus new to me, and how many books I've read overall. I think moving forward, or for next year, I want to find a way to track when I start reading something and when I finish it, because sometimes I'll read a book over the course of multiple months. I'll just finish it in one specific month, so then it just looks like I read this one book in this one month, which is not necessarily the case. It's a process, but this is what I have for right now. Most of the books I've read this year have been rereads, which is usually true for me. I love rereading books. I know some people don't. They're very one and done. I mostly reread books, which is not a good habit to have based on the number of books I'm also buying. I really need to be reading more of the books that I'm buying, but here we are. It's still fairly even, it's not totally skewed. Of the 25 books I've read so far, 14 have been rereads and 11 have been new. So it's a little skewed towards rereads, but it's been roughly about 50-50 so far. The skew is not as wide as I would have guessed that it would be. I would have assumed that I would be rereading way more books than I have read new books. So I'm pleasantly surprised on myself that it's been a pretty even split. Because 25 books is a lot, and I'm also considering doing a full wrap-up at the end of the year. Right now, I want to go through my top 3 and bottom 3. The third worst book that I've read so far is Elektra by Jennifer Saint. This one's not necessarily the worst, it's just among the ones that I liked the least. Not that I disliked this one, I just found it kind of forgettable. It's a retelling of the Oresteia from the perspective of Electra, Clytemnestra, and Cassandra, and it was interesting while I was reading it, and I enjoyed reading it, I think just because I really love Greek mythology, but afterwards I couldn't really give you a selling point about it other than if you like Greek mythology, this is a fun take on it, but it doesn't really stand out to me. And I know in the past few years there's been a huge trend of doing retellings of Greek mythology from the women's perspective, and I've seen some other people's videos on why they're not necessarily successful in trying to tell these stories through a woman's lens or through like a feminist lens, because they end up removing the women's agency in trying to give their perspectives. I'm not saying this, I'm not communicating this well. The point that I'm gleaning from some critics of this trend is that the original story and, the original play or the, Iliad or the Odyssey or the entire Oresteia give the women more agency than these modern retellings end up, or the retellings aren't modern, but the modern adaptations tend to. I haven't read the Oresteia in its entirety. I've seen one of the 3 plays, and that was a long time ago, so I would need to go back to do more comparison, but all in all, this just sort of was nice while I was reading it, but ultimately didn't really stick with me. The third best book that I've read so far this year has been The Kamigawa Food Detectives by Hisashi Kashiwai. It's just very cute. It's about a father and a daughter who run a teeny little restaurant, but if you have a certain dish from your past that you're trying to figure out how to recreate, they will do that for you, given, time and research and everything. It's told through a series of vignettes on different people coming to find ways to recreate a wide variety of different dishes. And it's really cozy, and it's really nice, and it really reveres the food and the ingredients that it's talking about, and really goes into depth on the sourcing process and how all the ingredients play off of each other, and the way it describes food is very beautiful. So this was a really lovely read. The second worst book that I've read so far this year was The Golden Spoon by Jessa Maxwell. The premise of this is essentially Great British Bake Off murder mystery, and I was really intrigued by the premise, and then that was the only thing that kept me going, was I was really intrigued by the premise. The writing was not very good. I really did not enjoy the writing style. I did not find it to be particularly well written, and the only thing that kept me from DNFing this was that the premise was so compelling, but you can't write a book off of a cool premise alone. You have to actually, write a good book. So it was fun because Bake Off murder mystery is cool, but not because the book was actually very good. There was also one detail about train schedules that really got on my nerves because it was just not at all accurate. One of the characters arrives by train to a train station that I have been to many times, and I know its schedule extremely well because it only has one train in and one train out per day, and they were talking about taking a train from a place that doesn't have a train that goes to this final destination at a time of day that train does not arrive there, and it really, really, really bothered me. Even though that was so irrelevant to the whole point of the thing, it was just right at the beginning, and I was like, there's no train from that place of origin that will arrive to this final destination, and it definitely doesn't arrive at that time of day. So that was a major pet peeve for me, because the train schedules are so easy to look up. And she just didn't. She just made up a train that doesn't exist. Anyway, this was fine because the premise was cool, but the writing was bad. The second best book that I read this year was Circe by Madeline Miller. In the first half of this year, all of the books I was reading were really getting me on the misandry train. A lot of boy do I sure hate men books. Circe is obviously a retelling of the life of Circe, who is the witch from the Odyssey. Madeline Miller just has a really gorgeous command of prose and really pulls you in with her writing style. I found Circe to be a very compelling and interesting protagonist, very complicated. I just loved existing in this world and Madeline Miller's vision of this world. Again, biased because I love Greek mythology so much, so I was already pulled in because of that, but then this also is just stunningly written, really makes you hate men. Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. And the worst book I've read so far this year was Pirate Latitudes by Michael Crichton. Arguably, I could say that The Golden Spoon is the worst one on a technical level that I've read this year. This one's the worst because it let me down. As is a known fact about me, I'm a huge fan of Michael Crichton. I own all of the books that he published under his own name, and I read this because I'm trying to read them all, and it's just not good or fun or interesting. And maybe it's because I don't particularly love pirate stuff. I like pirate movies sometimes, but when I'm reading, I'm usually reading sci-fi or fantasy, and this was mostly just historical fiction about a pirate raid, and the closest it got to any kind of sci-fi was the crew encountering the Kraken at the end, but everything just felt too convenient. The plot just sort of like hit the beat that it needed to hit and then moved on to the next thing. I just didn't really care at all. I wasn't gripped. I didn't really feel any suspense. And usually in Crichton novels, there's a lot of thrill and a lot of suspense. They're techno thrillers. So this was just hugely disappointing to me as someone who is generally a big fan of this catalog, that this was such a flop. So Pirate Latitudes so far gets last place. Finally, the best book that I've read this year so far has been The Wife by Meg Wolitzer. I'm a pretty big fan of Lena Norms and her YouTube channel, and this came highly recommended by her. She used to work in the publishing industry and talks a lot about books and gives a lot of recommendations and suggestions, and this one seemed really interesting, so I ended up picking it up, and I am so glad that I did. This was another one in the I Hate Men series of books from the first half of the year. It's hard to give a summary of this book without just giving away the whole thing. Essentially what the summary on the back says is that this woman decides to leave her husband while they're on an airplane on the way to a ceremony where he's going to be receiving a literary award. And it flashes back from the past and the present, talking about their marriage and their lives together, them making a family, and then also what happens at the ceremony itself. And it took me a minute to drop into this because I had to get used to the style of the book. It's very poetic prose, and I'd been reading so much straightforward prose up until this point that I had to really shift gears to get into the tone, but once I did, I was fully in it. It wasn't poetic prose that felt pretentious or overbearing. It felt necessary and welcoming. Even though it took me a second to get into it, it really pulled me in, and once I was in, I was locked in. And the whole narrative is just so compelling. It's so good. The characters feel so true, and they feel so grounded, even within the framework of extremely poetic prose. So, like Lena, I cannot recommend this more highly. So where are we now? What am I in the middle of right now? I am currently rereading a book that I finished in April because I'm just like this, all right? I don't know what to tell you. But the two other books that I'm in the middle of right now are What You Are Looking For Is in the Library by Michiko Aoyama and The Language of Food by Dan Yurovsky. What You Are Looking For Is in the Library is basically the book version of the Kamigawa Food Detectives. It's a bunch of vignettes about different people who go to this library and get book recommendations, and one of them ends up changing their perspective or changing their life. So another very cozy, comfy, easy read that I'm enjoying very much. The Language of Food is the first nonfiction book that I've talked about this entire video. Wow, crazy! It's essentially a linguistic history of food, and you could probably already tell that I really like food and talking about food. I like cooking, based on the way that I was talking about the Kamigawa Food Detectives, but the other thing is that almost all of my nonfic is linguistics related. I really love linguistics. I love languages. I like learning about languages and how they work and how we got to where they are. So having a book that is both about food and about linguistics is very exciting to me. And it is all super fascinating and super interesting. I'm not that far into it yet, only this far in, but yeah, I think this stuff is super cool. So that's where we are right now. August is almost over and I've finished 3 books this month. I'm hoping to finish 4 before the end of the week. We'll see where the rest of the year takes me.